There's a photograph that survives from 1947. It shows 11 boys standing in a line outside a farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania. Their faces are blank, not sad, not angry, just blank, like someone had reached inside them and scooped out whatever makes a child's eyes shine. The house behind them is tall and gray, with windows that look like they haven't been opened in years. At the far right of the photograph, partially cut off by the frame, is a man in a dark suit. His face is blurred, whether by the camera or by time, no one can say, but his hand rests on the shoulder of the smallest boy, and if you look closely, you can see the boy's shoulder is tilted downward, like he's trying to sink into the earth. The place was called Greystone Farm. It doesn't exist anymore. The buildings were torn down in 1953, and the land was sold to a developer who built a strip mall over the foundation. But for 6 years, between 1945 and 1951, Greystone Farm was home to dozens of boys no one wanted, boys whose families had collapsed in the aftermath of the Second World War, boys who were considered difficult, troubled, unmanageable. They were sent there by the state, by churches, by parents who signed papers they didn't read, and once they arrived, they disappeared. Not physically, but in every other way that mattered. The official record says Greystone Farm was a reformatory school, a place for rehabilitation and education. But the boys who lived there, the ones who survived and lived long enough to speak, called it something else. They called it the place where they learned to stop crying, where they learned that no one was coming, where they learned that some kinds of pain don't have words, so you just swallow them and pretend you're still a person. Most of them never told their own children what happened there. They took it to the grave, but a few of them left something behind. Letters, diaries, testimony buried in court records that were sealed for 70 years. And now those seals are breaking. This is what they never admitted. The man who ran Greystone Farm was named Howard Calloway. He was 42 years old when he purchased the property in 1945. Before that, he had been a schoolteacher in Ohio, then a chaplain's assistant during the war, though he never saw combat. He had references, letters of recommendation from church leaders and local politicians. On paper, he looked like exactly the kind of man you'd trust with broken children. Soft-spoken, educated, a man who talked about discipline and structure and the importance of moral fortitude. The kind of man who could look a desperate mother in the eye and promise her that her son would come back better, stronger, fixed. But Howard Calloway understood something about the world that most people don't want to accept. He understood that if you take children no one is looking for, children whose families have already given up, you can do almost anything to them, because who's going to stop you? Who's going to ask questions? The state sent a caseworker once every 6 months, and Calloway made sure the farm looked pristine on those days. The boys were clean, the dormitory was swept, there was food on the table. The caseworker would spend an hour walking the grounds, check a few boxes on a form, and leave. And the moment his car disappeared down the dirt road, everything would go back to the way it really was. The boys slept in a single long room on the second floor of the main house, 16 metal beds, thin mattresses, no heat in the winter. They woke at 5 in the morning and worked until dark, chopping wood, hauling water, tending to animals that were often as starved as they were. There was school, technically. A few hours in the afternoon where Calloway or one of his assistants would stand at a chalkboard and recite Bible verses or basic arithmetic. But the real education happened in the basement. That's where Calloway took the boys who broke the rules. And the rules were designed to be broken. Speaking out of turn, looking at him the wrong way, moving too slowly, crying. The rules were a trap, and every boy fell into it eventually. One of the survivors, a man named Thomas Ehrlich, gave a deposition in 1978 as part of a lawsuit that never went anywhere. He described the basement as a place where time stopped, no windows, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, a wooden chair in the center of the room. Calloway would make you sit in that chair for hours. Sometimes he would just stand there and watch you. Other times he would ask you questions, soft questions, about your mother, about what you were thinking, about whether you understood why you deserved this. And if you answered wrong, or if you didn't answer at all, he would remind you that no one in the world cared, whether you lived or died. And the worst part, Thomas said, was that you started to believe him. There were others who worked at Greystone Farm, but their names are harder to find. A woman named Mrs. Halloran cooked the meals and managed the kitchen. She was in her 60s, stern-faced, and according to the few records that mention her, she had worked in institutional settings before. Orphanages, asylums, the kind of places where you learn not to see suffering as suffering, but as something inevitable, something that simply existed like weather. The boys rarely spoke about her, and when they did, it was always in fragments. She wasn't cruel in the way Calloway was. She didn't hurt them directly, but she watched, and her silence was its own kind of violence. There was also a man the boys called Mr. Roots, though no one knows if that was his real name. He lived in a shed near the edge of the property and handled the heavier labor, repairing fences, slaughtering livestock. He was large and slow-moving, and the boys learned quickly to stay out of his way. Some of them said he was simple-minded. Others said he knew exactly what was happening and just didn't care. In one diary entry, a boy named Peter Lindgren wrote that Mr. Roots once told him that animals and children were the same. They only understood two things: fear and food, and if you controlled those, you controlled everything. But it was Calloway who shaped the place, Calloway who set the rhythm of their days and the tone of their nights. He had a way of talking that made you feel like he was the only person in the world who understood you. Like he could see inside your head and knew all the ugly, shameful things you kept hidden. He would sit with a boy after punishment and speak gently, almost kindly. He would say that the world was full of weakness, and that weakness was a disease, and that the only way to survive was to burn it out of yourself. He made it sound like love, like salvation, and some of the boys believed him. They had to, because if they didn't, if they let themselves believe that what was happening to them was wrong, they would have shattered completely. The farm operated on a system of silence. The boys were not allowed to speak about what happened in the basement. They were not allowed to comfort each other or form close friendships. Calloway called it self-reliance. He said that dependency made you weak, and that each boy had to face his own demons alone. But what it really did was isolate them. It turned them into islands. And on an island, there's no one to hear you scream. At night, in the dormitory, you could hear boys crying into their pillows. Quiet, muffled sounds like animals trying not to be heard. And in the morning, no one would acknowledge it. Because acknowledging it meant admitting that it was real. And if it was real, then you had to do something about it. And there was nothing any of them could do. In the winter of 1949, a boy named Daniel Marsh tried to run away. He was 13 years old, small for his age, with red hair and a cluster of freckles across his nose. He'd been at Greystone for 8 months. His mother had sent him there after his father died in a factory accident, and she couldn't manage him anymore. That's what the intake form said. Couldn't manage him. Daniel had stolen food twice. He'd skipped school. He'd talked back. Normal things for a grieving child. But normal wasn't acceptable. So she signed the papers and Daniel was gone. He made it 3 miles before they found him. It was January and the snow was deep, and he was wearing nothing but the thin gray uniform all the boys wore. Mr. Roots brought him back in the bed of a truck, half frozen, his lips blue. Calloway didn't punish him right away, he waited. He let Daniel sit in the dormitory for 2 days, thawing out, thinking maybe he'd been forgiven. And then, on the 3rd night, Calloway came for him. He took him down to the basement, and this time he brought the other boys. All of them. He made them stand in a circle around Daniel while he sat in the chair, shivering, crying, begging to go back upstairs. Calloway told the boys that Daniel had betrayed them. That running away was the same as calling them all liars, as saying that Greystone wasn't good enough, that they weren't strong enough. And then Calloway asked the boys a question. He asked them what they thought should happen to someone who abandoned his brothers. And one by one, the boys answered. Some said nothing. Some said he should apologize. But a few, the ones who had been there the longest, the ones who had learned how to survive, said he should be made an example of. And Calloway smiled, and he told Daniel to stand up and thank them for teaching him what loyalty meant. No one knows exactly what happened in the basement that night. The boys who were there never gave consistent accounts. Some said Calloway just made Daniel stand in the cold for hours. Others said it was worse, that there were things done to him that didn't leave marks you could see. What is known is that Daniel Marsh never tried to run away again. And when he left Greystone 2 years later, he didn't go home. He disappeared into the foster system, bounced between homes, and by the time he was 18, he was gone. No records, no trail, just another boy who slipped through the cracks. But Daniel left something behind. Years later, in 1984, a storage unit in Pittsburgh was auctioned off after the rent went unpaid. Inside, among boxes of old clothes and broken furniture, they found a notebook. It was water-damaged and falling apart, but you could still read some of the pages. And on one of those pages, in careful, childlike handwriting, Daniel had written a single sentence over and over again, hundreds of times, until the ink bled through to the other side. It said, "I am not allowed to leave. I am not allowed to leave. I am not allowed to leave." Greystone Farm closed in the spring of 1951. There was no scandal, no investigation, no reporters knocking on the door asking questions. Howard Calloway simply announced that he was retiring, sold the property, and disappeared. Some records suggest he moved to Florida. Others say he went west to Arizona or New Mexico. There's a death certificate from 1966 in Tucson that might be him, but the details are vague. He died in a nursing home quietly, surrounded by no one. If he ever faced consequences for what he did, there's no record of it. He was never charged, never sued, never even named in public. He just faded away, the way men like him often do. The boys were dispersed. Some went back to their families, though most of those reunions were brief and cold. Parents didn't know what to say to sons who had changed in ways they couldn't name. The boys didn't know how to explain what had happened to them, and their parents didn't know how to ask. So they didn't. They just moved forward. Pretended it never happened. Buried it under new lives, new families, new names. A few of the boys ended up in other institutions, psychiatric hospitals, prisons, the kinds of places society uses to store people it doesn't know what to do with. And a few of them simply vanished. No records, no graves, just names on intake forms that lead nowhere. But some of them survived. They grew up. They had children of their own. They became mechanics and truck drivers and factory workers. They lived quiet, unremarkable lives. And for decades, they never spoke about Greystone. Not to their wives, not to their children, not to anyone. Because how do you explain that kind of darkness to people who live in the light? How do you tell someone that you spent your childhood learning that you were worthless, that you deserved pain, that love was a lie told to people who were too weak to accept the truth? You don't. You just carry it, like a stone in your chest, and you hope that if you carry it long enough, it will eventually wear smooth and stop cutting you from the inside. It wasn't until the late 1970s, when a journalist named Claire Helmsley started researching forgotten reform schools for a book, that the stories started to surface. She found Thomas Ehrlich first, the man who'd given that deposition about the basement. He was 51 years old, living in a trailer park outside Erie, Pennsylvania. He didn't want to talk at first, but Claire was patient. She kept coming back, and eventually Thomas told her everything. And then he gave her names, other boys, other survivors, and one by one Claire found them, and one by one they started to remember out loud. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? If you found out your grandfather, your uncle, your father had been one of the boys of Greystone Farm, and he never told you, would you want to know? Or would you let him keep his silence? Claire Helmsley's book was never published. She spent 3 years gathering testimony, tracking down records, building a case that Greystone Farm was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger system of abuse that stretched across dozens of institutions in the post-war years. She had interviews, documents, photographs. She had enough to prove that what happened at Greystone was real, was documented, was known by people in power who chose to do nothing. But when she submitted the manuscript to publishers, they all said the same thing. Too dark, too specific. No one wants to read about this. One editor told her that Americans don't like stories where children suffer and no one saves them. It ruins the narrative. It makes people feel helpless. And helplessness doesn't sell. So the book sat in a box. And Claire moved on to other projects. And the boys of Greystone Farm went back to being invisible. A few of them stayed in touch with each other, loose threads of connection held together by shared trauma. They would meet once a year, sometimes less, at a diner or a park, and they would sit together in silence, because silence was the language they had learned best. They didn't talk about Greystone directly. They didn't need to. Just being in the same room with someone who understood, who had survived the same thing was enough. It was proof that they had been real, that it had happened, that they weren't crazy or broken or wrong for remembering. Thomas Ehrlich died in 1995, heart attack. He was 68. His daughter found a box of letters in his closet after the funeral, letters he had written but never sent. Most of them were addressed to Howard Calloway, though Calloway had been dead for nearly 30 years by then. The letters were full of questions. Why did you choose us? What did we do to deserve it? Did you ever think about us after you left? Did you ever feel anything at all? There were no answers, of course. Just questions shouted into the void. His daughter didn't know what to do with the letters, so she kept them. And years later, she donated them to a historical archive at a university in Ohio. They're there now if you want to see them. Filed under institutional abuse, mid-20th century, a footnote in someone's research paper. The last known survivor of Greystone Farm is a man named William Cortez. He's 91 years old now, living in a care facility in upstate New York. He doesn't give interviews anymore. He did, once, back in 2003, for a local newspaper that was doing a piece on forgotten history. He told the reporter that he still dreams about the dormitory, about the cold, about the sound of boys crying in the dark. He said that for most of his life, he thought he had escaped. He thought that by surviving, by building a life, by having children and grandchildren, he had won. But now, at the end, he understands that you don't escape a place like Greystone. It stays in you, in your bones, in the way you flinch when someone raises their voice, In the way you can't accept love without waiting for it to turn into something else. He said the worst part wasn't the pain. It was the belief, planted so deep you could never dig it out, that you deserved it. There's no memorial for the boys of Greystone Farm. No plaque. No monument. The strip mall that stands where the farmhouse used to be has a dollar store and a dry cleaner and a place that sells discount mattresses. People walk across that ground every day and have no idea what happened there. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some things are too dark to memorialize. Or maybe we just don't want to admit that this is part of our history, that we built a country where children could be disappeared, not by violence, but by paperwork. By signatures. By systems designed to look the other way. Greystone Farm wasn't an anomaly. It was a feature. And it happened because we let it. Because no one wanted to see. Because it was easier to believe that boys like that, boys no one wanted, didn't matter enough to save. The photograph from 1947 still exists. It's in an archive now, labeled and cataloged. 11 boys in a line. Blank faces, dead eyes, and in the corner, that blurred man with his hand on a child's shoulder. If you stare at it long enough, you start to notice things. The way none of the boys are standing close to each other. The way their hands hang at their sides, limp, like they've forgotten how to make fists. The way the smallest boy, the one under that hand, is looking directly at the camera. Not at the person taking the picture at you. Like he's trying to tell you something. Like he's begging you to remember. Because if no one remembers, then it never happened. And if it never happened, then all that suffering, all that silence, all those years of carrying stones in their chests, meant nothing. So we remember. Not because it's easy, not because it makes us feel good, but because they deserve to be more than ghosts. They deserve to be seen. Even now, even this late, they deserve to be seen.